Even if it's not your words, you're creating something. It's like a big giant slab of stone that you have to carve out.
Welcome to the Nieman Storyboard Podcast, where we dig into the craft of journalism and storytelling. I'm Mark Armstrong, editor of Nieman Storyboard. This show is brought to you by the Nieman Foundation for Journalism at Harvard. You can get updates by signing up for our newsletter. Just go to niemanstoryboard.org to sign up. My guest today is Tricia Romano. She's a journalist and author of the acclaimed oral history of the Village Voice, titled The Freaks Came Out to Write: The Definitive History of the Village Voice, the Radical Paper That Changed American Culture. The book was a finalist for the National Book Critics Circle Award for Nonfiction in 2024 and the Gotham Book Prize. It won the 2025 Penn Oakland Josephine Miles Award for Nonfiction. Tricia started her 8-year career at the Village Voice as an intern before becoming a contributing writer. I first got to know her byline when I moved to New York City in the early 2000s, when she was writing her column Fly Life about the underbelly of New York City's nightlife. As a reader, I've always been a fan of oral histories, so I wanted to talk with Tricia about what it's like for a journalist to take on an oral history project, how to stay organized, how to interview your subjects, how to find funding and grants, and how to structure a narrative which, in this case, spanned many decades of New York City's cultural and political history. And I'll just say up front that I appreciate Tricia's brutal honesty about the level of effort required for an oral history project like this. Be sure to check out the show notes for links to all the books and writers mentioned on today's episode. So without further ado, here's my conversation with Tricia Romano. Tricia, thank you again for being here.
Thanks for having me, Mark.
Congratulations on this book, which as of the time of this recording, the paperback edition has just come out.
Yes.
I wanted to just ask you, this is Storyboard, so a lot of our audience is journalists, and I want to dig into the geekery of constructing an oral history. I have always been a huge fan of oral histories. Like, there was an era in which magazines were doing every single oral history they could get their hands on. There was a GQ one about starships, we built this city, that I remember vividly. But I always found them so compulsively readable, and yours is certainly that. It's such a great book. And then it surprised me to hear you say in interviews that it was essentially pure hell to do an oral history.
It is as fun as it is for you to read, is as painful as it was for me to put together. There is a small club of us in the oral history book world, and we should all join like a therapy group together because no one understands. Because the genius of an oral history is that it looks, if it's done well, it's effortless. It reads. Mm-hmm. It reads very smooth and fun and quick. You know, even though the book is, 500, 600 pages, I feel like it is a very fast read once you start going. And once you stop worrying about who's this person and what's their title, I think a lot of people get hung up on, the cast of characters and trying to follow along. Once you stop doing that and you just kind of look at the quotes for what they are and what the story, look at it as narrative and not as, trying to trace all the characters and keep them all straight in your mind, it goes very, very quickly. I think that narrative oral history is distinctly different than what you would call formal oral history, which is probably what, you go to college to do. Like Columbia has an oral history program, and I found that when I first started the project, I went to them to see if I could collaborate or get some help or something. They have to sign a release. When I started, that was all news to me, right? Because I know the narrative oral history of magazines, and we don't do that. And it's, it's almost like raw text for you to, move around and cut up in like an editor does with film, a documentary editor. It's kind of the same thing to me. And so I remember I reached out to Gillian McCain she was the co-writer of Please Kill Me with Legs McNeil, which is to me like one of the top canon oral histories, narrative oral histories in the entire history of oral histories. I emailed her, cold emailed her, said, "Hi, I am doing this oral history on the Village Voice, and I'm drowning, and I don't know what to do. And can I ask you some questions?" And she became a very important person to me, and really helped me along the way, and confirmed that I was not crazy, and this was a totally intense, mind-bogglingly difficult project and form. And we were talking about the ins and outs of recording and release forms and all of that. And I told her like what I was told, and she's like, "No, we didn't do any of that. It's a very different form." And she also sort of pointed out things that I had been doing, but I didn't know if it was okay, because it's also not something that you are told is okay in journalism school, is, cleaning up the quotes. So like you don't do the dot, 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 dot ellipses. It's just, you want it to read like a narrative. You want it to read like you wrote it almost. And so you don't want anything like lots of bracketed, inserted phrases and all of this other stuff to take the reader out of it. And the other thing she pointed out in that I also followed is that when you are interviewing people, you are often interviewing people more than once. And as long as you're not changing the context, the meaning, you're not distorting their words, you can put them together. Mm-hmm. The first sentence of the second interview, how he tells this story, is so much better and better said, and is funnier than the second part, but I like the second part's original take. And so that I would merge them, and, you have to be very careful. You have to, when you're going through and you're editing this, you have to make sure, am I making something happen there that's not there? Mm-hmm. And you have to, you have to constantly be checking against the transcript and following, where did you get this and how did you get it?
Was this a book project before it became an oral history? How did you come to the point where it's like, one, I want to do this book, and two, I want to do this it was always going to be an oral history?
I cursed myself. I also curse Michelangelo Matos, who's a friend of mine who was, worked in Seattle Weekly, and he's written for The Voice and was the Minneapolis City Pages person. The whole reason I did this is because I went to the reunion at The Voice. There was a reunion in September 2017, and that was the year that Wayne Barrett, who was the big Trump biographer and the first person to ever write in-depth investigative journalism about Trump and Trump's organization and his racist policies to black renters in the late 70s. He had died, and he had died just before Trump was inaugurated. And then not very long after that, Nat Hentoff died, or I can't remember which order they died, but they died really quickly within a few weeks or months of each other. And then somebody, I think it was Michael Tomasky, who's the editor of The New Republic, got the idea that we should have a reunion / memorials / get together, and they started doing this big reunion, and it was all of the generations. And so I flew out to New York for that, and catch up with all my friends from back then, and it was just giant room in some East Village space that they had rented, and they had a stage, and they had a couple of people get up and give some speeches, and they also did a reading of all of the people who had passed, and which was quite long at that point. Susan Brown Miller got up, and Susan Brown Miller was the amazing feminist reporter at The Voice from the late 60s and early 70s, who wrote Against Our Will, which is a groundbreaking book about rape culture. I'm sitting there going, we have to get these people. What are we doing? They're going to go soon. I was just filled with panic, sheer panic. And so I called Matos. I was like, oh my God, like somebody's got to do this. And I had actually like before, and Hentoff had died and Wayne had died, I think. I had actually gone to Nelson George, who was a voice writer in the 80s. I was like, Nelson, we have to get these people. And he was like, no, it's too hard. It's going to be too hard. And I was like, oh God. And then when I saw this, I was like, called Matos. I was like, oh my God, Matos. He's like, you have to do it. And I said, it has to be an oral history, doesn't it? You had to capture their voices. That it wasn't my take on what the Village Voice is and was and means and all of that stuff. I pitched it as an oral history, like a crazy person. And don't do that. Actually,
this is going to be a great episode. How to do an oral history. Step 1, don't.
0 out of 10, do not recommend.
I'm hoping by the end of this conversation, we're going to have this shred of this moment like, well, but it's so worth it in the end. The readers love it. There are ways to do it. There are lessons to be learned, right?
It's funny because after I got done, I got a call from Emma Carmichael. Mm-hmm. She is a sports writer, and she's doing an oral history in the WNBA, which, great timing because of Caitlin Clark and all that. And she was just starting, and I was like, yeah, welcome to the club.
But I'm very excited to read that one, too.
That's going to be good. I mean, she's a killer writer, so I know she's going to know what she's doing. Part of the reason this is so much harder than I think it could be is because of the time span of this book, right? It's 60-something years. And
yeah, you start in the 1950s.
I start right when it starts. And there was a period where, my original manuscript was 400,000 words.
Wow.
So just to put that in context, they wanted 125,000 words. So my amazing agent, Betsy Lerner, who is like a titan of the literary world, who had been an editor before she became this very well-known agent, squirreled away my manuscript in bed and hid what she was doing from her husband during Christmas. And he was like, what are you doing over there? She's like, nothing. And she was going through and taking a big sword to large quotes and saying, this is boring. He's talking too long, and sometimes I disagreed with her and I would like overrule, but she really got me in the mindset of looking at it again with fresh eyes. And, because one of the things about interviewing people, at least for me, like I hear their voices in my head. I hear how they talk and I hear the rhythm of how they talk. And so when I see it on the page, I'm almost like, it's hard for me sometimes to divorce that. Like, oh, I like it when he says X, Y, Z, and then he like says this and this and this. And like I start to become more protective of those words, even though they're not mine, So she didn't have them memorized, like I almost had these things memorized, how they said it. So it was hard to look at it and be like, oh, that should go. Mm-hmm. Once you get to that point, it becomes faster and easier. And I had a couple people look at, this manuscript, like various versions. Lenora Chidoro, who is a voice VLS person, she did some editing on it and like helped me crunch some things down. Michelangelo Matos also helped. And he was also somebody that was very instrumental in like sending him stuff and being like, oh my God, can you believe this quote? He's like, that has to go in. That has to go in. It's very, you will look at a lot of oral histories, you will notice most of them have two authors. Mm-hmm. Most of them do. Because it is very hard to do a project of this scope with just one person. And I do also think that having two people solves the issue that I was just saying, which is like the other person can read that interview and see something you are not seeing.
Help get out of the weeds. Mm-hmm.
Get out of the weeds. And so I think that's why. But like I didn't do it. I did it by myself. Lizzie Goodman, who did Meet Me in the Bathroom, she also did it by herself. Emma's doing it by herself. And I think when you do it by yourself, it is going to take longer.
Yeah.
It's just going to take longer.
How many interviews total?
Like over 200. It might be 250. Yeah.
How many of those had you done by the time you put this book out for, put out the book proposal and put it out to publishers?
Very few. So and honestly, if I had to go back and do it over again, I would have done more. So I think there was like kind of a pressure to get something in quickly. I mean, quickly in book world, if you don't know, is not quickly in journalism world. Like, it's like a snail's pace. It's hysterical, which I'm finding is actually fast for Hollywood. So I did interviews with people about Wayne Barrett and the Trump story, and I made that my sample chapter. Spent another month doing more interviews and fleshed it out more. Because I do think like the advance that I got is in part lower than it should have been because people couldn't quite envision it. Or they didn't think it was right where it needed to be.
And did you supplement the advance did you go out looking for grants and that kind of thing to help fund the research in addition to the book advance?
I got a little lucky because of COVID. Because what happened with COVID is we got PPP grants. I'm a sole proprietor, 1099. There was another SBA loan that I got. I also got a bunch of city grants from the city of Seattle. And so I got lucky in a twisted way because of COVID. And then I did not know about this world until I started doing this book, is artist residencies. Usually artist residencies you think are the province of like fiction writers and playwrights and poets and artists. And I have never thought of myself as an artist, but apparently we are. And there is an art to this. So I applied to MacDowell at the same time as I applied for the Whiting grant, because as it happens, a lot of these things all have the same deadlines. And one of the reasons they do that is because they're all competing with each other. So they want the best. And then, so if you're a good writer, you're applying to 5 or 6 residencies and, they're all fighting for you and you're fighting to get into them. But one of the things about these artist residencies is that, especially if you're poor, they also pay you. They give you a little bit of money, not a lot. Like they pay for the rent that you might and your travel expenses. And a couple of times I got a scholarship for it. But that doesn't mean I didn't end up $30,000 in credit card debt at the end of this. So it could be much worse. So don't do this if you think you're going to get rich and famous. That's my, do this because you have to.
Yes.
There's no other way.
I want to switch gears and ask you about some of the structure and organization of your project. One of the many things I love about the book is that the oral history is also this cultural and political history of New York City. So just following that is really fascinating through the voices of the voice. And then I love oral history because it's also just such a honestly messy kind of way of doing narrative, because there are constantly people kind of casting doubt on each other's versions of the story, which I think is just a really transparent and honest way versus classic narrative nonfiction where you're on this kind of path that is very sort of clear and confident, whereas this is constantly throwing doubt into the mix. How did you organize yourself to be able to build the narrative? Are you starting with spreadsheets? Are you starting with timelines? Do you start constructing the narrative before all the interviews are done? What are you doing to stay organized?
This is something that if I ever do another book, I would change how I organize the material because I did not know what I was doing. I did eventually get a spreadsheet of every single person I interviewed with their contact information, their title, the years that they were there. links to the Dropbox link of their original file, link to the Dropbox link of their exported transcript, links to the Otter file. So it was like 3 different ways to find the transcript and find and listen to it in case. And, now that you have all this AI tools, that would be a lot easier. Not necessarily, it would be somewhat time saving. But the other thing I was told when I started, Nelson George told me, he's like, you need to map out the plot the way TV writers and filmmakers do. And I was like, what are you talking about? And he's like, in every TV show, like there's the long narrative, there's like the overall story, and then, there's a subplot, and then there's like the episodic plot. And that's how I had to look at it. And I was like, what's the big story? The big story is the story of the Village Voice, which is also the story of media, modern media, the rise and fall of modern media, and internet killing the newspaper star, and all of that. The sort of subplot is like what's going on inside the paper during this time. So owners coming and going, editors coming and going, the internal beefs with each other, the sort of office politics of that. And then the sort of episodic stuff is, the stories they're covering and what's happening in the city. And the only way to deal with, so I dealt with it like by time, so by decades, and then by topic, really. And because I couldn't see how else to do it. I couldn't braid it in this super fluid way. My brain just doesn't work that way. Maybe somebody else could have made it more like just this ebb and flow, but I felt like you had to hit certain points, right? And how do you cover film without stopping and saying, I'm covering film? And there was a point where this thing was so big, I debated, like, do I just do the 80s? Because the 80s was so intense, and it was the longest section. But I said, no, it needs to cover the whole thing, because otherwise that arc isn't there. Yeah. If you just do the 80s, you leave the Village Voice and it's on top of the world. And we know it's not. And it doesn't tell the story of media or newspapers or even the rise and fall of New York City as a cultural and political center. It doesn't tell the story of gentrification and the decimation of the city due to gentrification and, all of that.
And you were at the Village Voice for 8 years?
About that, yeah. 7, 8, yeah. Yeah.
And you started as an intern.
I started an intern in 1997. I was an intern for Frank Owen, who covered the Michael Alec Club Kid murder case. Totally crazy, Mancunian, Brit, lunatic, loved him. Just went running around with him to clubs and then called DE agents by day and talked to people who were probably drug dealers that night. And, just like crazy, it was just really fun. And he was great. And like, I have to say, like, in an era of that time, especially, with crappy media men and like the lasciviousness that sometimes a male mentor will exude over any female and young girl in the office, Frank never, ever did that. He always introduced me as his colleague, not his assistant, not his intern. My colleague. So that was really great. So I went there for like 3 months, and then I had to come back to Seattle, which is where I was living. And my friends who had actually like come out there with me, one of them was Catherine McGrath, and she was working with me at the University of Washington Daily. She stayed behind in New York. She stayed there. And then Leah Greenblatt, who was she became an editor at EW for a while and is now at the New York Times. She was also at the University of Washington Daily, and she went out there for an internship at the same time. She stayed. I had to come back, and I was here for like a year and a half in Seattle, working at the Seattle Weekly part-time and I was an editor at Resonance Magazine, which was like an independent magazine that was very focused on techno and electronic music at the height of that, which was like 97, 98. my friend Bill Ward, he was so mad at me. And he became the editor of Billboard much later. But I left and I went to The Voice. And right when I got there, the person that was like writing the little club call listings column left. And so they needed somebody. And I spoke techno, so very fluent in techno. And I did it. So that is how I got like a column, like right away, and it was a small column, and Fly Life came later, the bigger one. But it really, just boomed right in. It was so exciting, it was so fun, top of the world, great. And if New York Times hadn't had destroyed it and the internet hadn't had blown it up into smithereens, who knows? I might still be there in some capacity, because it really was a perfect job, because it was barely a job.
You love the people, you love the work, you could do your own thing.
Yeah. I walked in and I was like, this looks like a college newspaper, but like a little larger. Like it was just, rough around the edges. Robert Christgau was walking around in band t-shirts. Richard Goldstein, the executive editor, was like top of the masthead, was like rolling in at 1:00. This is before the internet. So like we were like waking up in a panic, like must blog. You didn't have to do that. So it was just like a dream, it was a complete dream. And I only got to experience it for a few years before it all started to crumble. And I just feel really bad for a lot of people that are coming up now that are students and they have no idea. And, I barely have an idea. And then the people that are like 10 years older than me, they never knew the bottom. They're still in those jobs, those guys. And they can tell you stories about, the $200,000 Condé Nast contract that they had, and, being flown places and put up in hotels. And now I'm like, can you write a 1,500 word story for $300?
Your writing and your work was part of my introduction to New York City too. So
Was it really?
Yeah, I mean, I didn't get to know you until we were both in Seattle at the same time. But I moved to New York City in 2001, and so your nightlife column was a part of my introduction to the city. So
I had no idea.
So I've known your byline for a long time, but it speaks to also just. I think the Village Voice has this deep connection in a lot of, even people outside of media, in a lot of people's lives, because they maybe found their first apartment in the Voice, or, I played in bands. I think the first band I joined, I found an ad in Musicians Wanted in the back of the Village Voice.
Right, of course.
So people have these feelings about the Village Voice, and the Alt Weekly has such a unique place,
yes.
And the Village Voice is just a perfect example of that.
I was saying to somebody the other day, I'm ruined for life. I was saying to my old editor of the book, Colleen Lowry, at the she's now at Bloomsbury. She was at Public Affairs, and I was saying, Colleen, I'm ruined for life. She's like, yes, you are. I had the most insane reviews ever. Every single review was over the top positive. The New York Times Dwight Garner review. I don't believe in being buried in an actual cemetery, but I might change my mind just to be buried in a cemetery, to have that entire review on the headstone. There was an unending parade of stuff like that. And a lot of it had to do, the book is good, great, okay. It has issues, not perfect. But I think it's because it's the Village Voice. And so many of the people that wrote about it came out of the Voice or had a fondness for the paper. Maureen Corrigan, who, is a famous NPR book critic, she got her start at the Voice.
Mm-hmm.
People at the City, Alyssa Katz, she got her start at the Voice. Dwight Garner wrote for the Voice. And, a lot of the people that were writing it, reviewing this, either wanted to be cool enough to write for the Village Voice, or they were. And so they just have this overwhelming fondness for this institution and sadness that it's gone. And in my book is it's a trip through nostalgia in some ways. And not all nostalgia is good, right? Like there's lots of stuff in this book that you would be horrified if it happened today in an office. And people would be fired instantly. So it wasn't all like rainbows and unicorns. And, I tried to show that. Because for every person that is fond about their time at The Voice, there are a lot of people for whom it was a dark place. They did not enjoy it. They want to forget it. They want to get away from it because it was so stressful, the ups and downs and ins and out and the intensity of the people there and the intensity of the fights, that were happening on staff was too much. Some people are still very bitter about things that did or did not happen for them there. They didn't get that promotion or somebody else did. But at the same time, I think a lot of us met our closest friends and our longest friends. Like I'm still very close to a lot of the people from that time frame. And part of that might be that it was my 20s. It's like post-college, early 30s. And I think that's the case. But then there's also people there who came in their 30s and 40s, and they're still very close to some of the people they were there. It's like we're all in a little bit of a cult of the Village Voice.
When you're doing an oral history, does it change how you conduct interviews?
Yeah, I think so. Interviews are longer, for one thing. I would say the standard interview for an oral history that I did was 2.5 hours, 3 hours. When I talked to Jillian, she said the longer the better, because you want them to just keep talking. You want to get them to go down pathways that you didn't know about. And, I always started almost all of my interviews with, very simple. Where did you grow up? How did you first learn about the Village Voice? When did you start reading it? Because those could be two different things. What made it so interesting to you? And how did you get there? Take me on your path to get there. And that is enough to fill about 45 minutes for some people, and what was really interesting was how many people took the same path, more or less. If they were New Yorkers, their parents read it, they grew up around it, they picked it up to, read about CBGB and all that stuff. And it was just like either you're drawn to it, it's something you are a part of, and this is what you need to do with your life, or you weren't going to be a person that went to the Daily News. Like this is where you had to go. Or if you were from far away, you were in a small town, or you were in a city that didn't have any counterculture, and The Voice was your window into that world. Back then you would have to send away for it and get it delivered to you. And it became this, sort of countercultural badge of honor that you were like carrying around with you. Like, hey, I'm cool. I've got the Village Voice, like letting everybody know that you're part of that. And then, they all that was it for them. They had to make their way to the city. It was their calling card to come to New York. And that was, I think, what it was for me. I think it was what it was for a lot of people. A lot of people I interviewed. It was almost the same two stories, and I don't think you're going to find that at the New Yorker or the New York Times or Daily News. Like, I don't know anybody else. It's like, I needed to move there because I needed to be a part of this very particular thing. So yeah, my interviews would be very wide-ranging. And when I heard Susan Orlean, as we were talking about earlier before we started this, talk about her interview process, it really resonated with me. When she does big profiles, she said she doesn't necessarily go in armed with a bunch of really specific questions. She almost wants to go in a little blind so that she's discovering their story as they're telling it to her. Because if she knows everything, you might skip over them telling you that story. And even so, I knew some people's stories pretty well. And, some people like Robert Christgau had written a book and he had told his story. He said, well, as I say in the book, I'm like, I know you said it in the book, but I need you to say it on tape. I need you to actually retell that story for me in your words as a interviewee. It's different, right? And that's the other thing, like writing your story is different from the oral telling of your story. You talk differently than you write, especially if you're a certain kind of stylist as a writer,
Yeah, that's a really interesting point about earlier published books, which if you're writing narrative nonfiction, you've read it and you can write into what you've picked up from the book and reference the book. Whereas this, you need it all in the quotes and the sound bites.
You need somebody to say
all
it.
to come from the person saying it.
I need to have somebody to say it. And that's why they're so hard, Mark. That's why they're sheer hell, is because you need them to say it. And when they don't say it, you've got to find a way to get them to say it, or you got to find somebody else that will say it. And there's, a couple of things, like we didn't talk about this, but like, there's a few quotes from me in the book, and that is just so that I can say the thing that the person didn't say. And I was also really adamant, and there's, different points of view on this. I did not want interstitial writing or any intros. And this was something I kind of disagreed with my original editor about with Colleen. We disagreed on this. She wanted me to have these written intros to each chapter. And I just didn't think that was necessary, and I thought it would be really disruptive to the flow.
Just take people out of it?
And take people out of it. It's kind of, if you think about it like a documentary. Like, if you're watching, a documentary, do you prefer the kind where, some narrator starts talking and interrupts the action to, explain things to you? It's a different style. And, there are good oral histories that use that style. I think it's a little bit of a cheat code if you're doing pure oral history, but what's the oral history that was about AIDS that Sarah Schulman did? She did interstitial stuff. It's really good. Let the Record Show, A Political History of ACT UP, New York, 1987 to 1993. Her oral history uses lots of interstitial and is much more of it's not narrative, really. It's much more we are recording this for history kind of thing. Like these it's very holding these voices, and so it's a different form. So to get around that, when I really needed a bridge, I would just have myself quote myself, and sometimes it just doesn't work. And if it doesn't work, you have to find a different way out of the chapter, or you might have to say, sorry, it just doesn't work, and there's not enough there. I did also use people's writings, dead people's interviews, if they had given interviews to TV shows or whatever, radio. Stanley Crouch did I think a PBS show or something, and Robert Christgau had, there was a quote from Robert Christgau, even though I had interviewed him a bunch of times, that was in an old documentary of him that Eric Weisbard said. And I just grabbed that one quote from that documentary because it was such a good quote. So you just have to be really resourceful and creative about getting that story down on the page, which is why I say it is much harder, but actually writing. It is a form of writing, even if it's not your words. You're creating something. It's like a big giant slab of stone that you have to carve out with only what you've got given to you. And so, me and Jillian say, copy and paste. They always mock it, like it's copy and paste. And the other thing is, when I finished this book, there were several people that, refused to talk to me, usually women from a certain era. They were very, burned by prior books that had been written about the voice or whatever. And one of them was a writer who I will not name, but it was one of the most disrespectful experiences I've ever had. She wanted me to add more information to the chapter that she refused to talk to me about to clarify something. And she kept calling it a correction, but it's not a correction. It was just like additional information. It just disrupts the whole copy flow, right? So I could only add so much. And she kept sending me exactly what she wanted to. And I said, well, thank you for this. I'm going to read this and I'm going to go through it with my editor. And then I will come up with how I want to write it. And she goes, well, I don't understand. Like, I've written it for you. You should just write it, as it is. And it started getting kind of contentious. We were on the phone. And I was like, well, I am the author of this book, so I will make the decision ultimately on how this is going to go. And she said, you're not an author. You didn't author this. You're not a writer. And it was to go back to what I said earlier. People do not understand how difficult it is. They do not understand how stressful it is. And it would have been a lot easier for me to just write this. I find writing very fun and very easy. I'm sick and twisted that way. I know a lot of journalists don't like writing. They like the journalism part. I like the writing part. I don't like the transcription and research. I just want to tell the story. Like, I want all that to be done, and I want to tell the story. It's really fun. I would have been able to write this much faster if it was not an oral history. There was something that I did that Nelson told me to do, which was like all that, but you use postcards and put things on the wall and like color code stuff, and I did like names and how they were all related, and like you have to like kind of do some visual organization. And the hard thing about living in the apartment that I live in, I don't really have the wall space for that. So that was where those artist residencies were really helpful. Because they had space, and like McGowell even has like walls so that you can put pins in them. And I kept, in some cases, redoing the same thing over and over just so I made sure, because the timing was hard. Like, I didn't want to introduce people too early to the year, even though sometimes people were talking from the future, were talking about the past. Like Joy Press came in into VLS much later, 90s or 2000s, that she would talk about the VLS in the past, right? But I didn't want her to come in too soon, because who is she? You haven't introduced her yet,
Yeah, I really love how you kind of ease in these characters and they kind of coalesce, and then some stick around, and then new ones come in.
Yes.
Just like the cast of characters is like this amoeba.
Yes, they constantly shift, and there's some people that are there the whole time, right? Like Richard Goldstein's there the whole time, or most of the time, and like David Schneiderman is there for a huge part of it. But then there's some people that are just there for a very discrete period of time, and that was a big challenge. I think if you're doing a book that's an oral history that of like a much shorter time frame, you won't have that issue. And there are still people I didn't end up getting to. There were people I interviewed I didn't use, and not because they were bad or they weren't important or whatever. But at a certain point, I had to stop, and I also had to weigh, like, is what they're saying any different than what the other person told me? Because one of the big downsides of oral histories, and some pitfalls of an oral history, is having 10 people say a variation of the same thing. And you will see that a lot in magazine articles, I think, more than you do in books. But you have to have, each quote needs to be like moving the narrative forward. It has to be propulsive. And the only time you want somebody saying similar things is like when there's a disagreement. And then like a third person can come in, well, actually, that is what happened. Or, like you could, where it's kind of settling a conflict or expanding on a conflict. But I find that some of the pitfalls, some of the problem with oral histories is that they can be repetitive if you don't watch out. You don't need 10 different people saying the same thing to prove your point. You're not convincing the reader that New York was the center of the world. You would need one person to say, New York was the center of the world and this is why, definitively, And even with the intro, I really had to struggle with that because a lot of them are, you try to look at it like, when they're all talking about what is the village voice, like you have to look at it as like many facets of a diamond that you're going to try and have them talk about different facets of each side of the diamond. And so it builds and builds and builds and builds. And then by the end, you get a full picture of what it is they're talking about.
You hit on something just now about a more compressed time frame, which I think could be good advice for jurors. Let's say they've listened to this episode and they said, okay, I appreciate that it's very difficult, but I still want to do an oral history. So compressed time frame is great advice. Do you have other advice for journalists and writers who want to take this and go forward and make something that I will love to read?
You better be in love with this subject. You need to be this needs to be like a blood oath that you're taking, because you're going to be doing this for years. It's all you're going to eat, sleep, breathe, think about. You're going to cry in your sleep. You're going to have dreams. You're going to suddenly wake up in the middle of the night in a cold sweat and go, oh my God, you got to get that quote from Robert Christgau about whatchamacallit. Oh my God, where is that? Who said that? And you have to really be sure this is the way you need to do it. And I think if you're going to do an oral history, the quotes have to be colorful and filled with life and not just information. You have to be able to coax people to talk to you and tell you their dreams and their, like your best friends. And then, buddy, I didn't know most of the people that I was interviewing. I think a lot of people assume that because I worked there. A lot of the people that I interviewed were all many, many decades before me. I didn't know David Schneiderman at all when I met him. He lived 1.5 miles away from my house in Seattle, which I had no idea. And he and I spent probably 12 hours together over several different instances. And what was interesting is they immediately were on board. They were immediately like, yeah, I can trust you. This is the story that needs to be told. We need to tell it. Make your list of people that you absolutely have to have and make an outline after you've talked to your initial people and just stay on top of everything, I think it's a really fun, if I had done this book the other way, it would have had potential to be dry and removed. Mm-hmm. And opened the door too much to, well, that's just her interpretation, which is not what I wanted. And I think letting the people you talk to shine and be as much themselves as possible is to bring the voice to that page is, super fun. I love all my Village Voice children. I love them. Even the crazy ones. And there was a lot of crazy ones, Even the difficult ones, I still love them.
That is a beautiful note to end on. Tricia, I feel like we're just getting started, but this has been so wonderful.
Thank you. I love talking to you, Mark. Absolutely. So much fun.
Thanks again to Tricia, and thanks to all of you for listening. If you like what we're doing with Nieman Storyboard, leave us a written review and a rating in Apple Podcasts or Spotify. You can also share this podcast with a friend. We'll see you soon.